Hello, Brovs. We're back with Triad, a novel of the supernatural by Mary Leader. This is chapter 2. If I can find it. Probably should use a bookmark, but why would I do something like that? As I look back, the book incident was not the first time I had detected something amiss. There had been other occurrences so insignificant they passed by without notice. For instance, things wouldn't be where I left them. I didn't pay any attention at first because I'm careless about leaving papers and books and other items strewn around, often not remembering where I dropped them. When something is lost, usually the last place I look is where it belongs, because I know that's where it won't be. But now things mysteriously began to appear in their proper places more often than was normal, and I had no memory of replacing them. Shelves and closets just seemed to rearrange themselves. Actually, I was rather pleased with myself. I was becoming a housekeeper at last, and so painlessly. But no copy of Dr. Rubin's book showed up, nor had I expected it to, and that bolstered my conviction that somehow, someone, maybe a resentful neighbor whose coffee clatch I'd scorned had taken a small revenge. Surely when Marion Dahlman returned, she'd be able to provide an explanation. When another overdue notice arrived and I went back to try to clear up the matter, I found Marion at the desk. Yes, Mrs. Ingle asked me about it. She told me in a pointedly businesslike manner. Then she lowered her voice, directing her remarks away from other people waiting at the desk. Really, Mrs. Erickson, you and I both know that you did check that book out, now don't we? Hers was the tone of a teacher who has just caught a student stealing out of someone else's locker. Mrs. Erickson, she called me, although we'd long been on a first-name basis. I don't know any such thing, Marion, I protested. I didn't check out that book. Now, Mrs. Erickson, she was losing patience. I know you very well, and I don't think you have a twin. I could feel the muscles tightening in the back of my neck. There has to be a mistake, I floundered. Her brown eyes never wavered. As a matter of fact, Mrs. Erickson, she repeated my name with exasperating deliberation, you were wearing the same dress that day you have on now. For some reason, this woman doesn't like me, I told myself. She has access to the library cards. She could have used my number and written that review. But why? Why? It was all so senseless and not like Marion Dahlman at all. Still, how else could this be explained? Maybe she envied my mini career. Life as a small town librarian had few diversions. I don't know what you're trying to do, Marion, I said. I only know that I never checked out that book. I don't have it, and you can just stop sending out notices. Painfully aware of the astonished stares following me, I hurried out of the library and into the car, where Lance leaped joyfully upon me as if I'd been gone for a year. But I pushed him away sharply, started the car, and drove home dangerously, knocking him off his seat several times as I swung around corners, all the way conjuring up spiteful images of Marion Dahlman. The car stopped with a lurch, inches short of the back wall of the old carriage house, which was our garage, and my peak ended there. Lance had flown forward and struck his head against the dashboard, then flopped down on the floor. Only momentarily stunned, he retrieved his dignity and crawled back on the seat beside me, whimpering softly. As I soothed him, my sense of proportion returned. Marion Dahlman was none of the things I'd been imagining her to be. I knew her better than that. In fact, she'd always been extremely gracious and helpful. Besides, her position as librarian was undoubtedly more lucrative than my reviewing career to date. Perhaps it was a memory slip on her part or confused incidents in the past. I must have been wearing the dress when I checked out some other book. Yes, that must be it. But how was I going to convince her? She was so very positive. My head had begun to throb, so instead of going into the house immediately, I walked with Lance out on the east lawn. It was a day to cure headaches. Willows gyrated their feathered veils in the crisp lake breeze. No wonder Hellas is their goddess. lime gold against the black green of the tall spruces interspersed sedately between them. As I passed, a robin darted from the lower branches of one of the spruces to the high arch of a willow spray and began to scold me. Four turquoise eggs lay in a woven bowl. I hurried on so she could return to the nest, intersecting a dark shadow that fluttered across the lawn. I looked up in time to see a crow light on top of the spruce where the nest was hidden. It flapped its wings, announced itself, then quieted down and sat there brooding. A little beyond, a flock of unwelcome visitors, grackles in their funereal finery had settled about a bird feeder, and I shuddered for the four new lives as yet unhatched. Once again aware of the pain in my head, I trudged into the house. Maybe I fixed supper for myself, Alan was gone again, or maybe I just went to bed to nurse my headache. All I can recall is that when I opened my eyes, it was morning, and the sunlight was making prisms out of the old-fashioned beveled glass panes. Lance jumped onto the bed and started to wash my face. Sputtering, I gently repulsed him and was surprised at how curiously stiff and rebellious my muscles were. A knock at the back door brought me hurrying down the kitchen, still trying to stuff my shirt tail into my slacks. "Why, Mrs. Lemke," I exclaimed to the round-cheeked woman in blue and white print cotton dress and a red sweater. "I hadn't expected you until tomorrow. This is only Wednesday." She laughed as though were joking. "Not by my calendar, Mrs. Erickson," she said gaily, setting her things down on a kitchen chair. "I went to prayer meeting last night, and that's always on Wednesday night." "Aina?" "Ina? What does that mean?" A-I-N-A. I nodded in mute agreement. The Lutheran calendar was not to be denied, but what had happened to mine? By this time, Mrs. Lemke, who never wasted a moment, had headed for the living room to start the dusting, while, with shaking hands, I measured coffee for us into the percolator. Where had Wednesday gone? Above me on the wall, I could hear the whir of the kitchen clock. Through the window, I saw Lance disappearing into the woods north of our house, after a rabbit, no doubt. What about him? Had he been trapped in the house all the time I was sleeping? It was inconceivable, but I must have slept the clock around twice. No, 3 times. From Tuesday night until Thursday morning? Lance was a perfectly house-trained dog, but after all, there's a limit to everything. I thought I had better check the basement before Mrs. Lemke went down there. Just then, she stuck her head through the swinging door. "Looks like you did a pretty good job yourself yesterday," she remarked. "How did you manage to move that furniture all alone, or is Mister here?" "What do you want me to do today, besides the wash?" The front room was alien in its immaculateness. All the junk mail that had been piling up on the stereo had been removed. The furniture gleamed from the patina of new polish. The carpeting was brightened as though shampooed. But strangest of all, nothing was in its usual place. The piano and Davenport had been interchanged, chairs and the coffee table rearranged, and Alan's contour chair moved from its spot by the fireplace to the opposite side of the room. That would never do. Only the stereo and the heavy bookcases remained in their original positions. I could feel Mrs. Lemke's eyes searching mine. "Oh, I felt ambitious yesterday," I lied, massaging a kink in my leg. "I wanted to try out a new arrangement, but it's not going to work out. We'll have to move Mr. Erickson's chair back to its old place, that's for sure. He'd have a fit. I don't know what I was thinking of. You can start moving things back to the original positions. I'll be back in a minute to help you." The cellar steps were curved from the wear of generations, making descent into the basement a hazardous maneuver. If Lance had done anything down there, I wanted to clean it up before she saw it. In the harsh, intrusive light of a naked bulb, the old washtub stood gray and passionless against the shining white of the modern washer and dryer. Gross anachronisms in this pocket of the past. Here the massive structure of the old house was laid bare. Its 2-foot thick walls of stone masonry and the heavy beams still with hand-wrought nails in them. Attached to the furnace chimney was the ancient wood stove, I often used as an incinerator. Once, when the electricity failed during a storm, I prepared breakfast on it. The past was not without its conveniences. The house also boasted a pair of cisterns. One stood like a sarcophagus at the far end of the basement, its sand-colored concrete sides glazed with dampness and age. It had probably been added as the house had grown to catch rain off the many-faceted roof after other one. Rain off the many-faceted roof after the other one, which was below floor level, had proved inadequate to hold both the groundwater and the runoff from the roof. The older cistern lay like a subterranean lake beneath a large patch of wooden flooring, its water inky in the cellar gloom. The only entrance to it was by a trapdoor, which had been in bad repair when we bought the house. I made Alan fix it so that it would be firmly over the hole, as I was afraid Lance or any unwary repairman might fall through. Alan also repaired the system of alternating pumps, which we discovered had been cleverly fitted with a valve so that water could be drawn and filtered from either cistern for washing clothes. I checked the laundry chute, empty. Even the wash had been done. It was fortunate I hadn't told Mrs. Lemke to strip the linen from the beds. How could I have accomplished all that and not remember if I did it? But somebody had, and that was somebody had to be me. And that somebody had to be me, I decided. I struggled vainly to remember, but my mind produced only a blank. And I could detect no sign of desperation on Lance's part, so someone had to have let him out. Strange sort of amnesia, and not altogether undesirable, if only it weren't so uncanny. Uncanny. I wondered if the shoemaker and his wife hadn't had mixed feelings when they discovered their work had been done for them overnight. Mrs. Lemke's heavy steps thudded overhead. She'd be waiting to hear from me. I'd better think of something else for her to do, quick. Mrs. Lemke, I called up the cellar speaking tube. Ja, Mrs. Erickson, her voice echoed back. We won't be washing today. I did it yesterday. I wanted to get things out of the way because I had another project in mind. Would you be willing to help me paint the kitchen? Oh, sure. I'll be up in a minute if the coffee's ready. Go pour yourself a cup. There's some coffee cake in the bread box I added. Ja, Mrs. Erickson, I heard her say, and then, yes, Branwen, in a whispery voice quite unlike hers. I must have misheard her, I thought. Grabbing a bottle of paint and varnish remover and some sandpaper from Alan's workbench, I hurried back upstairs to continue instructions. Mrs. Lemke was holding a plate that was empty of everything but crumbs. That coffee cake is all, she said, reproach implicit in her tone. Oh, I hesitated. Oh, yes, I ate it yesterday. I forgot. Well, we can toast some frozen waffles. No, thanks. I had waffles by my house this morning already, she informed me. But you better eat something. No, I'll just have coffee, I replied. I want to get to the hardware store to pick up some paint. While I'm gone, you might make up the bed. The sheets are fresh, so you won't have to change them. Then you can finish in the living room, and if I'm not back before you're done there, you can start sanding in the kitchen. Painting the kitchen was an inspiration. It answered Mrs. Lemke's questions, and certainly the kitchen needed it. Alan and I had covered the stained and chipped yellow walls with wallpaper that had an indefinite pattern of silvery green willow wands over a pink sunset background, but we hadn't gotten around to the cabinets and moldings, which previous owners had layered with a dark varnish that clung in gluttonous beads. Mrs. Lemke's abundant supply of elbow grease would come in handy for sanding the aged varnish. The job went faster than I expected. The more I moved around, the more my muscles loosened. Mrs. Lemke and I worked together so well that we even had time to do the long, narrow butler's pantry before she had to leave to prepare dinner for her son. There were still the little finishing touches to be applied, however, so I munched on whatever I could scrounge out of the refrigerator and kept going until nearly midnight. By now my head was raging again. No wonder, with that paint smell. But what an improvement in the kitchen. I cleaned the brushes, removed the masking tape, folded up the paint clothes, cloths and put them out in the shed with the empty cans of paint. Then I stumbled upstairs and to bed. The next thing I remember is opening my eyes to see Alan's trousers draped over a chair. So he'd come home early. Yes, there was his suitcase standing open near the closet, still packed. I turned over, feeling the full impact of stiff muscles on stiff muscles in every joint. Outside, Lance was barking joyfully, and Alan shouting to him in that game of tag they always played. Wondering what time he'd gotten in, I turned and saw the dent in the pillow. He must have come in sometime during the night and hadn't awakened me. Dear Alan, he was always so considerate. I'd better get down and fix breakfast or brunch right away. Sausages were browning, and I had just ladled the first pancake onto the hot griddle when he came in. Lance following him proudly with the morning paper between his teeth. Alan was humming softly under his breath and looking at me with new interest in his eyes. I turned my head to give him a greeting kiss and found myself locked in an embrace. The aroma of burning pancake assailed my nostrils. Extricating myself, I lifted the charred specimen off the griddle and dumped it in the garbage. Sorry I slept late, darling, I said, spooning out another pancake. I hadn't expected you until tonight. Thanks for not waking me. I was tired. But he wasn't listening. His arms encircled me, and he ran his lips softly over the back of my neck. Hey, you'll make me burn this one too, I protested, pushing him away. He remained silent, but I could feel his eyes on me. Were you surprised about the kitchen? I asked finally, as I flipped the pancake over. How do you like that shade of hot pink? Don't you think it's a good match? A hot wife makes a better one, he murmured, coming at me again. Oh, Alan, really? I shoved him away. Ho ho, he exclaimed, turning me toward him and putting his finger under my chin to lift my face to his. So we have Branwen again, and just last night you said you'd thrown her out of the window, and from now on, we're dedicating yourself to loving Alan Erickson because he is what he is, and not just because he might be the father of your future children. I tensed. Oh, I did now, did I? I parried. And if I'm no longer Branwen, just what is my name, may I ask? A very odd one. Another Welsh one, you said, like Branwen, and a lot harder to spell, but I like it. Say, what's the matter? Don't you remember telling me? I placed the pancake on his plate, trying not to let my hand shake as I did so, and then started to ladle more batter onto the griddle. Of course I do, I retorted, but I'll bet you've forgotten it. Welsh names aren't easy. I'll never forget this one. Rhiannon. Rhiannon! I stood there with the bowl suspended and batter running unheated over the rim of the griddle onto the stove. Where's it, Rhiannon? Hey, watch what you're doing, he exclaimed, grabbing the bowl out of my hand. Actually, I was grateful for the diversion that afforded me the chance to avert my eyes and hide the shock that must have been reflected in them. He helped me clean up the mess, and somehow we got through that miserable breakfast. We chatted and admired the rosy glow of the kitchen, and I did my best to find out, in an oblique way, what actually happened the night before. The most I could determine was that Alan had caught an early plane in Denver, and within an hour after I had collapsed on the bed in sheer exhaustion, wearing an old mended yellow nightgown, Alan had arrived home to find Aphrodite waiting up for him in a sheer black negligee. He mustn't know I don't remember, I told myself. I must take for my own the thing that isn't mine. How had this come about, and why, if it had happened as he said? Was I back in my old gown this morning when I awoke? Had I really suggested that he call me Rhiannon? But if I hadn't, where could he possibly have gotten that name? How could he know that such a name even existed unless he'd read Welsh folklore, which was highly unlikely? I've changed my mind about that secret name, I said, trying to sound casual, but my hand was really trembling now as I poured syrup on my pancakes. Why? I like it. It does things to you. I'm going to call you that from now on. That is, when we're alone. Well, don't. I spoke more sharply than I meant to. I don't know why I said that last night. I suppose the name just popped into my head and sounded romantic for the moment, but I really don't like it much. It's from an old Welsh fairy tale. My grandmother used to tell me, no one is ever called Rhiannon anymore, at least not in this country. No one I'd ever heard of, that is, except my cousin, and I had never mentioned her to Alan. Why should I? She had died so many years before. I'll admit it's a strange name, and I wouldn't even attempt to spell it, he said. It's even odder than Branwyn. Branwyn is odd, I bristled. You're lucky I wasn't named Sir Dwen, cried a lad, or Blotto Wed. He threw up his hands in mock horror. You win, he said. I'll settle for Branwyn. Although I did like Rhiannon. There's something silken about that name that suits you. In fact, you look like a Rhiannon. So had I then. So had I then, though I was 4 years younger than she, but it was not surprising. Our parents were two sets of identical twins, so we were as close kin as you can be without being sisters. After Alan left for his office and I had cleaned up the dishes, I went to my study to read. The next book from Wes had arrived and I was anxious to get at it, but I found I couldn't concentrate. The name Rhiannon seemed to be written at the top of every page. I finally put the book down and went into the backyard, Lance bounding down the path ahead of me. Tulips outlined the carpet of violets and lilies of the valley the length of the walk. As I stopped the flick of the seed pods of several tulips that had dropped their petals, I noticed some upstart thistles that had invaded the violet bed. A stab of pain rewarded my foolhardy attempt to pull them gloveless. Sucking my wounded fingers, I continued past a bed of Virginia bluebells, which were like bits of lake peeking through the filigree of wild columbine that grew among them. Above, a canopy of white lace mantillas sheathed the talons of a miniature grove of hawthorn. Beyond were the green fronds of raspberry bushes just beginning to show clusters of hard, pale green buds, which in a couple of months would swell into ruby velvet, while the velvet on the stems would harden and sharpen into thorns. I looked towards the woods in the ravine, where white patches of trillium showed through the trees, and I longed to go in there in search of morels, and maybe with luck an early lady's slipper or two, but recent rains had left the ground too soggy. Raspberries and rain, and a little cat buried. But that was all so long ago, I mustn't think about it. Had the robin babies hatched yet? I turned back toward the house by way of the willows and pines, approaching the nest softly so as not to disturb the mother if she were there. But she wasn't, and the nest was empty. On the ground I saw the remains of newly hatched birds, shredded by cruel beaks, and in the distance I thought I heard a robin cry. Back in the house I tried to settle down to my reading again, but I couldn't sit still. Why should the mere mention of that name affect me so? I went upstairs and made the bed, then unpacked Alan's things and put them away, stopping myself just in time from throwing the clean things down the laundry chute with the soiled ones. After that, I just paced, barely conscious of what I was doing, wandering aimlessly from room to room, reliving that summer and the day I had wanted to forget. Woo!